When privilege collides with justice, watch as an arrogant socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and learns a life lesson she'll never forget. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation that morning. People shuffled into their seats, whispering, curious, waiting. It was a typical day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, except for one thing. This hearing was different. It was expected to draw attention. Tiffany Holstead, a well-known socialite infamous for her reckless behavior and inflated ego, was set to appear before Judge William Grant, a man revered throughout the legal community for his unwavering fairness and sharp intellect. He was not one to be swayed by status or spectacle. Tiffany arrived predictably late and unapologetic. Draped in designer labels and oversized sunglasses, she strolled into the courtroom like it was her personal runway. Her lawyer followed closely behind, visibly tense, trying in vain to keep the scene under control. As she entered, the room fell silent. All eyes turned. Tiffany paused in the center aisle, seemingly unaware, or uninterested, that others were waiting for her to sit. With a dismissive wave, she acknowledged no one, her entitlement on full display. She motioned for her lawyer to move aside so she could set her designer handbag on the bench. Her entitlement was palpable. With an exaggerated flair, she removed her sunglasses and scanned the room as if it were all beneath her. Moments later, Judge Grant entered. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The murmurs ceased, replaced by a respectful hush. In his mid-50s, Grant was an imposing presence, tall, composed, and quietly authoritative. His sharp eyes surveyed the courtroom before he took his seat at the bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Tiffany hesitated, clearly annoyed, then finally stood with a dramatic sigh. Her expression practically screamed, "Why am I even here?" Judge Grant didn't flinch. He calmly adjusted his glasses, opened the file in front of him, and began the proceedings without so much as a glance at her attitude. The case itself was simple. Multiple unpaid parking violations and a recent incident of reckless driving that nearly injured a pedestrian. On paper, it should have been a routine hearing. But Tiffany's arrogance was about to change everything. As Judge Grant began reading the charges, Tiffany's body language shifted. She crossed her arms, leaned back, and rolled her eyes, clearly bored, possibly even amused. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and rolled her eyes, a blatant display of disrespect that didn't go unnoticed. But Judge Grant chose not to address it. Instead, he carried on with composed professionalism. His tone was measured, his words deliberate, as if daring her to continue her performance. The tension in the room began to thicken. Even the most seasoned court regulars sat a little straighter, sensing something brewing beneath the surface. Tiffany, oblivious to the storm she was inviting, had no intention of backing down. She shifted in her seat, her irritation growing with every word Judge Grant uttered. Then came the nails. Tap, tap, tap. Manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the wooden table, loud enough to draw sideways glances. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, perhaps urging her to rein it in. But Tiffany waved him off with a flick of her hand, her face full of defiance. The room, already on edge, seemed to hold its breath. When Judge Grant finally asked her to confirm her identity, she barely looked up. "Yeah, that's me," she muttered, voice laced with indifference. A quiet gasp moved through the gallery. The arrogance was staggering. Judge Grant's expression remained composed, but his eyes, sharp and unblinking, told another story. Judge Grant's gaze lingered on Tiffany for a moment longer than usual. "Miss Holstead," he began, voice steady and composed, "in this courtroom, we maintain a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, as if his words were part of some inside joke only she understood. She leaned back in her chair, twirling a strand of her blonde hair between her fingers. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. A few soft gasps rippled through the gallery. The court reporter hesitated, her fingers briefly frozen above the keys. Even Tiffany's lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. But Judge Grant remained unshaken. "Miss Holstead," he said again, this time firmer, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany rolled her eyes, again, then sighed loudly. "Honestly? It's just a few dumb parking tickets. And what? Someone got scared because I hit the gas too hard? This whole thing is a waste of time." Silence blanketed the courtroom. All eyes shifted to Judge Grant as he calmly closed the folder in front of him. With deliberate precision, he removed his glasses and set them on the bench. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had frozen. "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant said slowly, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I would advise you to choose your words very carefully from this point forward." The shift in his tone caused even the most indifferent court spectators to sit up straighter. A hush swept through the room. But Tiffany, still blind to the gravity of her situation, simply shrugged. "What?" "It's true," she said, leaning forward now. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." What she didn't realize was that her words were no longer being dismissed. Judge Grant's silence was not indifference. It was intentional. The entire courtroom could feel it. Something was about to happen. He leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze locked on Tiffany. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Even her lawyer, who had been nervously shuffling papers, paused to glance up at the bench. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Holstead?" Judge Grant asked, his tone measured, almost conversational. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his words commanded attention. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I do. Come on. It's not like I robbed a bank or anything. This is just overkill." You could feel the courtroom hold its breath. She waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away an invisible annoyance. Judge Grant nodded slowly, folding his hands on the bench. "I see," he said, his calm demeanor somehow making the tension in the room even sharper. Spectators leaned forward, sensing a shift. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Holstead," he continued. "The charges against you include not only reckless driving, but endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime, but by its impact. Do you understand that?" Tiffany rolled her eyes again, muttering under her breath, "Sure, sure." "Whatever you say." The words were barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the courtroom, they carried like a shout. A few gasps broke out. Her lawyer stiffened. The judge's expression didn't change much, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. A pause followed. Not long, but long enough for everyone in the room to sense that something was coming. "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant said, still calm, but now with unmistakable weight in his voice. "Do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago? The one that brought you here today?" Tiffany shrugged, with an exaggerated sigh, clearly unimpressed. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked. He moved. End of story." The judge raised an eyebrow. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she replied, arms now crossed in defiance. "No harm, no foul." But Judge Grant wasn't finished. He reached for a document on the bench, flipping through it with measured precision. Then, looking up, he addressed the courtroom. "Let the record show," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, is a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher. He was crossing the street lawfully when Miss Holstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and fall, resulting in a fractured wrist. He has since required medical treatment and continues to suffer ongoing pain." Tiffany's smirk wavered for the first time. She glanced at her lawyer, who leaned in to whisper something urgently. But, once again, she brushed him off with a dismissive flick of her fingers. "I didn't hit him," she muttered under her breath. "He was fine." Judge Grant turned his full attention to her, his eyes unwavering. "Miss Holstead," he said, his voice cool and composed, "does that still sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Before Tiffany could respond, the judge continued, his next words cutting through the room like a blade, stripping away any illusion that this was just another meaningless appearance. His steady gaze remained locked on hers. His voice, though calm, now carried the unmistakable weight of judgment. "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant began, his tone firm but measured, "your perspective on this matter is troubling. Not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of your actions." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, feigning indifference, but the rising tension in the courtroom was impossible to ignore. "Look," she scoffed, "I already said I didn't hit him. People are just so dramatic these days." A few audible gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Grant paused, tapping his pen lightly against the bench, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dramatic?" he repeated, the word heavy with disbelief. His tone remained composed, but each syllable struck with precision. "Would you care to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Holstead? Because he's here, today, in this courtroom." A hush fell over the room, the air thick with anticipation. For the first time, Tiffany's confidence seemed to falter. Her eyes flicked toward the gallery, where a man sat quietly in the second row. Mr. Edward Lopez, his arm in a sling, watched the proceedings with calm reserve. There was no rage in his expression, only the quiet, undeniable weight of disappointment. Somehow, it landed harder than any accusation could. Tiffany shifted in her seat, her posture stiffening. The defiance in her eyes flickered, but it wasn't entirely gone. "I'm sure he's fine," Tiffany muttered, though her voice now lacked its earlier bravado. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding every inch of the room. "Miss Holstead, your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But understand, this isn't just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege behave as though they are above accountability." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen echoed like thunder. All eyes were fixed on the judge. Then, with a calm that only deepened the gravity of the moment, Judge Grant said, "Since you appear unconcerned with the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany blinked. Her earlier confidence visibly crumbled. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice edged with real uncertainty for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the bailiff, who stepped forward and handed him a small stack of documents. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read aloud, each word deliberate. "Miss Holstead, you are hereby sentenced to pay all applicable fines associated with your violations. Additionally, you will complete 80 hours of community service, specifically within programs serving vulnerable pedestrians and traffic safety awareness. Furthermore, you are ordered to attend court-mandated sensitivity and civic responsibility training. He paused, then looked directly at her. Perhaps when you stand on the other side of disregard, you'll learn what it means to respect the space, safety, and dignity of others. Tiffany sat frozen, the weight of her choices, for the first time, settling fully on her shoulders. But it wasn't the penalties themselves that had the greatest impact. It was the way Judge Grant delivered them, woven into a powerful message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society. Yet what truly shook Tiffany and the entire courtroom was the unexpected final decision. A sentence that would force her to confront reality in a way she never anticipated. Judge Grant set the papers down slowly. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. The weight of his next words seemed to press into the silence of the room before they were even spoken. "Miss Holstead," he began, each syllable deliberate, "I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions, and more importantly, your blatant disregard for accountability, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address your legal violations, but offer something far more valuable: perspective." Tiffany sat up straighter, her usual flippancy faltering under the weight of his tone. "Perspective?" she echoed, her voice edged with disbelief. "Yes," Judge Grant replied firmly. "In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the Downtown Rehabilitation Center. There, you'll be assigned to assist individuals recovering from injuries sustained in traffic-related incidents." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. "This is not meant to punish you," the judge continued. "It is meant to show you the very real consequences of careless behavior, the kind you dismissed so easily." Tiffany's face paled. For the first time, she had no snark, no eye roll, just silence. "You will work at the women's shelter," Judge Grant continued, his voice steady and authoritative. "You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then, you'll begin to understand the true impact of carelessness and entitlement." A collective murmur spread through the courtroom. This was not the typical sentence anyone expected in a case like this. The crowd's mixed reactions were palpable. Some nodded in approval, while others exchanged incredulous glances. But the most telling reaction came from Tiffany herself. "You've got to be kidding me," she snapped, her voice rising. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." Judge Grant's expression remained calm, but his voice grew colder, carrying the weight of firm resolve. "Miss Holstead, it is precisely that mindset that brought you to this courtroom today. Your actions reveal a profound lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices impact those around you. This is not a punishment. It is an opportunity for growth. And let me be clear, failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged urgently at her sleeve, whispering words she ignored, but she yanked her arm away. "This is insane! You can't force me to do this!" Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing her outburst with a quiet authority that filled the room. "Miss Halstead," he said firmly, "this court absolutely has the authority to mandate community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning. Your supervisor will submit weekly progress updates. And, should you fail to cooperate," he paused, "you will return to this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances." The room fell silent once more. His words hung in the air like a final verdict. Tiffany's face flushed with frustration, her lips pressed into a thin line. But for the first time, she didn't respond. She just sat there, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses, his expression steady and composed. He allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of what was to come settle across the room. "Miss Halstead," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice, and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has protected you from consequences for far too long, and in doing so, it has cost you something even more valuable: empathy." He leaned forward slightly. "This is not about punishment. It's about responsibility, and the hope that, through reflection and service, you might begin to understand the world beyond your own. It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany, visibly unsettled, glanced toward the gallery, her bravado slipping further with every passing second. She opened her mouth, as if to protest, but thought better of it and closed it again. Judge Grant leaned back slightly, his tone softening, almost conversational now. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked how he felt about you?" Tiffany shook her head, eyes flickering toward the man seated quietly in the second row. Mr. Lopez hadn't moved. His arm was still in a sling, his expression unchanged. No anger, no outrage, just the same quiet disappointment. "He said," Judge Grant continued, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand. Because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people. And one day, it might be something she can't undo." The words struck like a blow. Tiffany's face paled. Her composure, already fraying, unraveled completely. For the first time, her defiance gave way to something else: discomfort, maybe even the first flicker of guilt. But Judge Grant wasn't finished. "Mr. Lopez," he said, "a man you nearly injured has chosen grace over anger. He could have pushed for harsher penalties, but instead he asked for something far more powerful, an opportunity for you to learn." He paused. "That's what this sentence represents." Tiffany shifted in her chair, her shoulders tense, the weight of the moment finally pressing down on her in full. Her confidence eroded. The room was so quiet that every sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, felt unnaturally loud, each noise echoing in the charged silence. "You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning," Judge Grant continued, his voice steady but resolute. "There, you will meet women who have faced challenges you cannot begin to imagine. Some have lost everything, others are trying to rebuild their lives from the ground up." He let that sink in before finishing. "You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you begin to understand the value of humility and accountability." Tiffany looked like she wanted to object, to push back, but the weight of the moment held her in place. Her lawyer placed a calming hand on her arm, silently urging her to stay still. For once, she did. But even as the judge's words began to settle in her mind, the real transformation, if it were to come, would only begin once she stepped outside the sheltered bubble of her privilege and into the raw reality that awaited her. Then came the final moment. With a sharp crack, the gavel struck. "This court is adjourned," Judge Grant declared, rising from his seat with quiet authority. He exited the bench, his robe flowing behind him. The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It lingered, heavy in the air, like the aftermath of a storm, one that hadn't cleared, only shifted course. But it left its mark. Tiffany remained seated, her expression a mixture of disbelief and simmering indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear, but she barely responded, her eyes fixed on a meaningless spot on the table in front of her. The courtroom began to empty, the quiet buzz of whispered conversations growing louder as spectators filed out, eager to discuss the spectacle they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez rose from his seat slowly, his arm still cradled in a sling, a quiet, undeniable reminder of the event that brought them all here. As he walked past Tiffany, he gave her a final glance. His expression was calm, kind even, but firm with resolution. Tiffany didn't look up. She kept her gaze anchored to the table, her defiance now replaced with something less certain. Shame, maybe, or confusion, or both. Outside the courthouse, a wall of reporters had already formed. The hearing, dramatic and unexpected, had become instant headline material. Tiffany Halstead, once just another name in the tabloids for her socialite escapades, was now the face of courtroom consequence. Cameras flashed wildly as she stepped through the courthouse doors, her lawyer at her side, shielding her from the swarm. "Miss Halstead, do you have any comment on today's sentencing? Do you feel the judge was too harsh? Will you comply with the terms?" The questions came rapid fire, slicing through the air. For a brief moment, Tiffany's old arrogance flickered back to life. She raised her chin slightly, her voice sharp and dismissive. No comment. And with that, she pushed forward into the crowd, away from the cameras, the questions, and maybe, just maybe, toward something resembling accountability. She snapped, pushing past the crowd and into the waiting car. But once the doors shut, and the shouts of reporters were muffled into silence, the facade began to crack. Her shoulders sagged, her gaze dropped, and for the first time, reality seemed to settle in. That evening, the story dominated headlines across media outlets. Clips from the courtroom, especially Judge Grant's final remarks, went viral. Conversations erupted online and on television. Social media lit up, divided between praise for the judge's measured approach and scorn for Tiffany's entitled behavior. But among the noise, one voice stood out. Mr. Lopez gave a brief statement outside the courthouse, just a few quiet words. "I don't want her to fail," he said. "I just hope she learns, because when we stop learning, we stop growing. And that's when we truly lose." His words were simple, but they struck a chord. The sincerity, the grace, it resonated far beyond the courtroom. For Tiffany, though, the real lesson was only beginning. Monday loomed ahead, and with it, a world unlike any she had ever known. A world without velvet ropes or red carpets. One that didn't care who her parents were or what brand of shoes she wore. What Tiffany was about to discover was this: real change doesn't come from being told. It comes from witnessing, from doing, from feeling the weight of someone else's reality. And when Monday arrived, it brought more than just an unfamiliar chill in the autumn air. It brought a chill in her chest, the creeping realization that for the first time in her life, she would be stepping into someone else's world. Not as a guest, but as a student. She stood outside the downtown women's shelter, her oversized sunglasses shielding more than just her eyes. They hid the hesitation, the uncertainty, the discomfort gnawing at her composure. The building in front of her was simple, worn but alive with purpose. Volunteers and staff bustled in and out, their faces focused, their movements efficient. For the first time in a long time, Tiffany Halstead felt completely out of place. As she stepped through the front doors, the air changed. The warmth inside wasn't just from the heaters. It came from the voices, soft conversations, laughter, the rhythmic clatter of kitchen utensils. It was the sound of people trying, of lives being pieced back together. A woman in her 40s approached, wearing a staff badge and the kind of no-nonsense expression that came from years of experience. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I'm Leighton. Let's get you started." The hours dragged at first. Tiffany was assigned to the kitchen, chopping vegetables, serving food, scrubbing trays. It was physically demanding and far removed from her carefully curated world. She kept her head down, silent, her usual arrogance stripped away by the reality around her. But as the day wore on, something shifted. She began to notice things. The sincere thank yous whispered between bites of food. The inside jokes shared by staff who had clearly weathered storms together. And most of all, the quiet strength of the women who passed through these doors every day. At lunch, she sat beside a woman, tired but composed, who balanced a toddler on one hip while her two other children shared a tray beside her. "I used to think I had it all figured out, too," the woman said, unprompted, glancing Tiffany's way. "Then life reminded me how fast everything can disappear." Tiffany didn't know how to respond. The woman wasn't angry or bitter, just real. Her words weren't meant to shame. They were an invitation to understand. And for the first time that day, Tiffany felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Humility. She said, her eyes locking with Tiffany's, "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." That night, as Tiffany drove home, the usual noise in her head had quieted. No music, no phone, just the echo of the day. Faces she couldn't forget. Words that wouldn't leave her alone. Judge Grant's voice replayed in her mind, not with the sting of punishment, but with the weight of possibility. For the first time, she wondered, what if there was more? More than the luxury and labels, more than curated brunches and hollow parties. Her life, once untouchable and insulated, suddenly felt small. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany returned to the shelter each morning. At first, out of obligation. But as the days passed, something shifted. She no longer counted the hours. She listened more, spoke less. She learned names, heard stories, and stopped looking at people like characters in a world separate from hers. The walls she had spent years building, walls made of pride, status, and fear, began to crumble. By the time her sentence was over, Tiffany Halstead was no longer the same girl who had stormed out of a luxury car weeks ago. She stood before Judge Grant once again. Her posture was still proud, but the defiance was gone. In its place was something more honest. "Thank you," she said, voice clear, even, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, the stern edge of his face softening. "The real thanks," he said, "will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany stepped out of the courthouse, the morning sun spilled over the steps. It was warm and sharp, like a promise. She paused, took a breath, and for the first time in a long while, didn't rush to escape the moment. There was still a long way to go, but this time she was willing to walk it. She carried with her a quiet but powerful hope, a chance not just to rebuild her life, but to reshape her perspective. Tiffany's journey became a reminder that real change is possible, but it doesn't come easily. It requires humility, courage, and the strength to face one's flaws head-on. So ask yourself, what will you do today to open your heart and mind to the lessons life is trying to teach? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that spark reflection, growth, and a deeper understanding of the human experience.